Okay, so 10-mark question. Let's get right on with it. Assess whether complete nationalisation, this looks like a good question, of the rail industry might protect employees. Okay, so protect the shareholder of employees. Now let's have a read of these extracts and see what it is mentioning. I'm guessing it is going to be in this extract from the title, A Case for Nationalisation. I remember nationalisation is taking a private firm and making it into a firm owned by the government, whereas privatisation is doing the opposite, taking a state-owned firm and changing it into a privately owned firm. And of course, you should know the advantages and disadvantages for both of them, as a very, very common exam questions. Okay, so with regards to this extract, there's not really much in this. This extract B looks a bit better, unless, since it's of course talking about employees, so that it was paid nearly £500,000. Let's have a read of this. So essentially, he's been paid a lot, even though the company has been failing. This increase calls for nationalisation and a maximum wage for executives at companies with government contracts. Now, main word there, main phrase is maximum wage. 100% we can use that in this question. And it contrasts the pay for a train driver, which is of course a great comparison we can use for application. And towards the end it mentions trade unions, which of course is a massive part of the labour markets topic. In the last lines of this extract here, which is pretty much the only decent part of this extract, the simple solution is you reunite track and train in the only feasible manner, which is nationalisation. So essentially, what the track and train is right now, there are lots of private companies who own different sectors, and it mentions it here as well, where when the government decided to privatise the railway system, they fragmented it. They pushed it into 3 separate sectors, which is track, train operators and rolling stock. But now, by nationalising the railway, they're going to bring them all back together, and there's going to be one basically company, one firm that owns the entire thing. And of course, that company being the government. But now, let's try to put 2 and 2 together. If there's one company that owns the entire sector, and we're thinking about labour, we're thinking about employees, what negative effects could that have on labour? And where do we see that in the real world? And the example I'm going to give, should give it away, is the NHS. Of course, the NHS is a national health service in the UK. It's funded by the state. And how does the NHS interact with doctors? How does it interact with nurses? And what do we call the NHS? Of course, we call the NHS a monopsony. And of course, this would be a point against nationalisation, that now the government would gain monopsony power. And if the government gains monopsony power, it now means that they can use that monopsony power to suppress wages. As remember, they will be the sole employer of any sort of labour in the railway industry. Therefore mean employees are worse off / they're less protected. So definitely my main point against there is going to be monopsony power. Okay, and one thing I've just picked up reading this extract is that it's actually extremely confusing. So it talks about a case for nationalisation, so moving from a privately owned firm to a state-owned firm. But then it talks about how tracks were renationalised in 2001. But essentially, the main thing you need to remember here is when the government privatised the railway system, as it mentions here, they fragmented it. So they privatised it in 3 different sectors: the track, the train operators and rolling stock. So essentially what the government did in 2001, they took back control of the track. So essentially the infrastructure, so the train stations themselves, the tracks themselves, the government regained ownership of that itself. So that was renationalised. So essentially you could call the UK railway system, it is definitely not purely private, and it's definitely not purely nationalised. It's almost a hybrid. And a really good case study we learn is there used to be 4 main, there used to be lots of different train operators. So like I said, the tracks themselves are owned by the government, but the companies themselves that run the trains are not, they are private firms. So for example, there used to be Virgin Trains. So Virgin Trains was one of the big firms that bidded for the contracts of the railway, so running the railways. However, now within the UK, do you see many Virgin Trains? No, since they were taken over by LNER in 2018. Why is that? Since Virgin Trains could not essentially provide a good enough service, they had I think it mentions it in this extract actually somewhere. And yeah, it does mention in this extract here where Virgin Rail had to basically shut down because of low passenger numbers, revenue less than forecasted, things like massive strikes by train drivers. And now, so what happened after that? Of course, the Department for Transport had to step in, as if there's no trains running. They have to, of course, solve that issue. And LNER now, of course, is another firm, but this isn't another private firm. This is a state-run firm. So you could almost say it has basically this route now has been nationalised. So the other thing about LNER, so you could essentially say that Root was nationalised since LNER is a state-owned firm. A lot of the other big train firms such as Transpennine Express, Northern Rail, ScotRail, they're all state-owned firms, so basically they're all nationalised firms. So you can definitely use that information as an evaluation point, talking about how most of the UK railway is pretty much essentially now nationalised. Yes, there are a few firms like the Midlands Trains and some other trains where they aren't owned by the government and they're private firms, but mostly the UK railway system is fairly nationalised. So nationalising every single one of them, how big of a difference will it make? Another great one you can mention is, of course, I don't know why we're going into evaluation points now, but you could also talk about the degree of regulation. Since the Department for Transport, of course, the government, they regulate these private firms very heavily to make sure everything is met, customer satisfaction, the trains aren't running late, things like train drivers are not striking, to make sure that essentially that the consumers are getting a good service. So whether these firms are nationalised or whether they are privatised, it doesn't really matter, since the level of regulation is very high, meaning that consumer outcomes, which is the main thing we care about, remain high. And you could use that to emphasise opportunity cost. If consumer outcomes are fine, is there any need to allocate resources to nationalise? So definitely something to keep in mind. Okay, so for this paragraph, this is the chain of analysis I'd write. So nationalisation, so going from the private sector to public sector, basically explain it briefly. This will therefore mean the government is the sole employer of labour in the railway sector, and add a start in there, probably just get something from the extract. Then railway workers essentially mean they have no other choice but to accept government wages. Why? Since there will be no other significant employer of railway workers. For example, just like in the UK healthcare scene, the NHS employs, I think, over 90% of healthcare workers, since yes, there is the private healthcare, but it's such a small percentage compared to the National Health Service. Therefore, doctors basically have two choices when they graduate. They either join the NHS or they stay unemployed. So of course, there's not much of a choice. So therefore, the government can use this monopsony power to suppress wages compared to a competitive market. Compared to what is the competitive market? Compared to if the firms were privatised. Since if the firms were privatised, they would be able to go to the other train operating firms. So we talk about how this monopsony firm is going to use its monopsony power to suppress wages compared to a competitive market. Now, for Edexcel, this is not a required diagram, but 100%, depending on when you're watching this, if it's 2 days for your exam, probably, yeah, it's not a good idea to remember this diagram. But if you have enough time for your exam, and for example, you're just revising, this is an absolute gem of a diagram to learn. And of course, it is just the monopsony diagram. So demand equals MRP, margin of your product, then supply equals average cost of labour, and then we have marginal cost of labour. Now, what does this show? Where the firms usually profit maximise, where MC equals MR, that's the same here. So where MC equals MR, so that would give me that point there. Now, how do monopsonies work? So let's first work out the quantity. So monopsonies profit maximise, or you could say they're wage maximise, since of course we're talking about labour markets, where MC of L equals MRP, or where MC equals MR. There's an easy way to remember it. But that means they should, and they can pay this price. So they can pay the wage of W1, we will say. However, do monopsonies do that? No. Since monopsonies, of course, use their monopsony power to suppress wages. So instead of paying a wage of W1, they will use that monopsony power and go down until they hit their supply equals AC of L, and they will instead pay workers W2. So that demonstrates their monopsony power. So they should be paying workers W1, but instead they pay workers W2. But how do we contrast this with a competitive labour market? And of course, we can show that using just what would a competitive market look like. They of course reach equilibrium where supply equals demand, which would be at this point here. And therefore, we're going to say Q2 of labour, and then we'll say W3. So essentially, the monopsony uses monopsony power to suppress wages, and we can see that compared to a competitive labour market, as competitive labour market would be paying workers W3 wages, whereas a monopsony only pays them W2. Of course, since a monopsony is paying them lower wages, it means they're able to attract less labour. Plus, there's also only Q1 of labour compared to Q2. Now, that is an extremely brief overview, but a lot of the high yield points of the monopsony diagram. Yes, it's not explicitly on the Edexcel spec, but especially when speaking about monopsonies, it's an absolute great diagram, and you can relate that. For example, instead of just saying they suppress wages compared to a competitive labour market, you can show it on the diagram, add that diagrammatic analysis, just elevates your chain of analysis to a different level. So 100%, if you have the time, I would 100% take the time out, learn this diagram, as it's an absolute gem. Now let's move on to evaluation, and of course, your first evaluation point that should pop into your mind whenever you're thinking about monopsonies should, of course, be, however, in evaluation, this depends on the density of trade unions. Why? Since, of course, if there's, and you can of course show it on the monopsony diagram as well. But why does it depend on the density of trade unions? As of course, if the density of trade unions is high, it will decrease the monopsony power within the market. And of course, with trade unions, they use the collective bargaining power to negotiate higher wages, which decreases the degree to which this monopsony can exploit its workers with its monopsony power, thus meaning it helps protect workers, essentially, helps protect employees, relating it back to the question, of course. And a good few stats just to remember with regards to trade union, of course you can throw them in. For example, trade union density right now in the UK is around 22%, but at the peak of the UK's trade union density was around 30% trade union density. So 1 in 3 workers almost was registered to a trade union. And a bit of general, just great application is, of course, the density of trade unions. So right now in the UK, the density of trade unions is 22%. But the significant thing is 50% of the public sector workers have a trade union. So essentially, majority of the individuals within trade unions are working in the public sector, for example, teachers. Okay, let's briefly go through the point 4. So why does nationalisation protect employees? And I'm going to use this point here, where essentially, we set a maximum wage for executives at companies with government contracts. And why do we need to do that? And how is that going to protect employees? I'm going to leverage the fact that the government can, of course, decrease the level of income inequality within the railway sector. So, for example, they can set maximum wages on the executives, and it means that, for example, like I said, the executive, the train driver is making not even 10% of what the CEO essentially made. So what the government can do, they can step in, reduce the wages of the CEOs, and therefore reallocate those resources, reallocate that money to pay their workers better. Of course, how would they do that, and what was my main thing I would reference? Of course, the diagram. And what diagram would I be talking about here? Of course, it would be the maximum wage diagram. So wage on your y-axis, quantity of labour on your x-axis, supply, demand. And now, if we're setting a maximum wage, this is a classic mistake. It agonises me that students make it, but it's such a common mistake that students make in exam questions. So now, we're setting a maximum wage. If we're setting a maximum wage, so what was the wage before for these executive managers? It said around £495,000. So that is the equilibrium wage initially. We get rid of WE and put that there. Again, that means that we're including a bit of real world application as well. But if we're setting maximum wage, what we're trying to do, are we trying to increase or decrease the wage? Of course, we're trying to decrease the wage. Therefore, that means the maximum wage must be set below the equilibrium wage. So this is going to be W max. And now, of course, how does that affect this labour market? The labour market moves from equilibrium to now being in disequilibrium. Why? Because now we have quantity supplied at Q1 and quantity demanded at Q2. And remember, in labour markets, who does the demanding, who does the supplying? The firms do the demanding for labour and the workers do the supplying for labour. So now we have Q1 quantity supplied and we have Q2 quantity demanded, which means therefore there is what? There is a shortage of labour. So of course, in this paragraph point, you could evaluate saying, how of an evaluation by the government setting a maximum wage, trying to reduce the level of inequality within this new nationalised firm, it will cause a shortage of managers, shortage of higher level staff. But my main point is, my main argument is that how is it going to protect employees? The government can allocate fairer wages and reduce inequality. So essentially, the way I'd word the paragraph, I agree that nationalisation can protect the railway industry's employees. Why? Since the government can set a maximum wage, which will therefore lead to fairer allocation of wages. As by setting maximum wage, of course, it's going to reduce the wages of the highest income earners in the company, therefore meaning that the government can use that reduction in wages to reallocate those wages towards, for example, train drivers, like I mentioned here, quoted a bit of the extract and said train drivers make less than 10% of what the chief executive officer made. Therefore, of course, essentially leading to fairer wages and fairer outcomes for the employees. Of course, the main evaluation point being shortage of labour, so it may lead to a massive decrease in the number of managers, as since, of course, these highly skilled, highly experienced workers do not want to work for lower wages. Therefore, with less managers, it could actually lead to a massive disruption within the for the employees, for the train drivers themselves. Since yes, they may be getting paid higher wages, but since they don't have managers, the workload might increase massively. Therefore, actually lead to worsened allocation of resources. And of course, maximum wages has many different negatives, since of course the extract does mention that this the chief executive he was responsible. Well, he did run a company that was associated with delays, losses, cancellation, strikes, but it can't entirely be his fault. Yes, he was probably overseeing it, but there are probably many systemic problems which are completely out of his control. And by setting a maximum wage, by reducing the wages of these bosses, it means that it really reduces the incentive for these individuals to work hard to supply their labour, for example, thus meaning in the long run can lead to very, very poor outcomes and much worse outcomes than before. Of course, a lot of that could be related to the concept of government failure. But yeah, for this 10 marker, of course, you do not need to go into as much detail, but it's a very good question with nationalisation. Something like this could come up for like 15 marks, for example, even a 25 mark question. So I just wanted to go a bit more in depth with it, especially with a monopsony diagram. Of course, I would not be drawing both monopsony and a maximum wage diagram for a 10 mark question. And of course, I want you to use these videos as a revision alongside, of course, exam technique as well, since a lot of the content we go through is very effective, since we're already going through what comes up on the exam papers, since it's basically the most high yield bits of the content you need to know, and of course including as much application and evaluation as possible. But let's keep going and let's move on to that 12 mark question.